Now, when I was in 12th grade, halfway through 12th grade, I started at a new high school. And at this high school, I went one day, and it was a spring day. I went into the school, and I sat down, and I noticed that something was very smelly. It was smelling up, and I was like, what in the world is that? And I could only smell it when I was sitting down. And so this went on for about a week until I finally realized that stinky smell, which by the way is sort of like a gym bag that had been left in the locker over spring break kind of smell. Some of you know what I'm talking about here. So that smell was actually coming from me. And so I realized that my classic Van shoes had apparently gotten wet at some point. And then when they dried, they just got super stanky. And so they were stanking it up, if you know what I mean here. And so every time I would sit down, what I was smelling was my feet coming up to me. Now, do you ever want to hear that your feet are super stinky? Not something that a 12th grader wants to realize as he's like in small groups with his class and everything. But knowing that helped me be able to fix the problem that I had. It helped me be able to go, Mom, my shoes stink. Can you fix it? And my mom was able to figure something out here. Again, we don't like to hear that kind of news, but knowing it enabled me to be able to fix the problem. Here's another example. How many of you like to hear, hey, you've got a big booger on your nose? No hands here. Bless you. No one here. None of us like to be told you've got something hanging out of your nose there. No, we never intentionally put something there and are like, hey, I'm waiting for you to tell me, because that's just not something that we want to hear. But knowing that there is a booger on our nose, it helps us be able to fix the problem. And so we don't want to hear it, but once we do hear it, we're like, oh, well, I'm not glad that happened, but at least someone told me so I can, or as my kids would do, and get rid of it. On a more serious note, there is a NBC reporter on TV, and after one TV report on the show, she received an email from someone that she did not know at all. And the email said this: "Hi, I just saw your news report. And what concerned me was the lump on your neck. Please have your thyroid checked. Reminds me of my neck. Mine turned out to be cancer. Take care of yourself." And so, that was not news that she wanted to hear from someone. But she took that news to her doctor. The doctor checked it, and it turned out that she did indeed have cancer. And so, she was able to, because someone spotted it, she was able to get it taken care of sooner rather than later. And so she wrote an email back to the person who wrote her, and she said this: had I never received that email, I never would have called my doctor. The cancer would have continued to spread. It's a scary and humbling thought. I will forever be grateful to the woman who went out of her way to email me, a total stranger she had zero obligation to, but she did so anyways. Now, we're in a series through Romans, and in the past few weeks, we've seen how various groups of people need the good news of Jesus. The good news being that hey, we are full of sin, but Jesus stepped in, sacrificed his life for us, and now all those who put their faith in him are clothed not with our own righteousness, we don't have a lot of that, but clothed with the righteousness of Jesus upon themselves. And that's good news right there. And so immoral people need the good news of Jesus. We saw that in chapter 1. But good moral people also need the good news of Jesus. We saw that at the beginning of chapter 2. And then we saw at the end of chapter 2 that even religious people need the good news of Jesus. Because you can do these religious activities. You can read your Bible. You can go to church. You can do these things and not know Jesus. And if that's the case, you are just as bad off as any of these other groups. And now in chapter 3, Paul's going to be talking about why this is so important, why each of us needs the good news. The good people, the quote-unquote bad people, the religious people, all people, why we need the good news. And in doing so, he's going to first give us the bad news. The bad news in chapter 3. I like how one pastor opened up his sermon I saw on YouTube in this way. He said, "Is everyone having a good day? Well, I'm about to ruin it for you." Well, that's sort of what this sermon is like here. This is not a happy sermon well, we'll see at the end. But it's not just a, hey, let's feel good about ourselves. This is a, I'm not so good kind of sermon. But just like we don't like the bad news, sometimes we need to hear it. And sometimes hearing it will then help us to make adjustments in our life. And as we'll see, and that adjustment is turning to Jesus Christ. So if our shoes are stinky, we should know the problem so we can fix the stinkiness. If we have a booger hanging out of our nose, we should know about that so we can pick it. And if you're one of my kids, eat it. If you're someone else, wipe it and get it out. If you have cancer, none of us want it. But if you do, knowing it will help you be able to then diagnose and hopefully fix the cancer, get the cancer out of your life. And so let's go ahead now and let's just get the bad news out of the way. Let's rip the Band-Aid off. And the bad news is the title of the sermon. If you saw it in the teaching sheet here, the bad news is you stink. You stink. I stink. We all stink. But this is not simply just an olfactory thing, like a nose thing that we smell. All of us stink down to the core of our life. And so I'm going to go a little bit out of order in chapter 3. Today we're going to focus on verses 9 through 20, where he focuses on what the bad news is. Next time I will go back to verses 1 through 8, where Paul's going to talk about some objections that he's used to hearing about the good and the bad news. And then we'll press on then after that to later in chapter 3. So a little out of order, but we will eventually cover all of it. And so, the bad news, starting in verse 9. Let's read that. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under sin. And so we saw in the last chapter that the Jews were the ones that had been given the law. They had been shown what God said to them, and they knew it. So they were the quote-unquote the religious people. The Greeks, on the other hand, were people that, the non-Jews, the people that did not know the law. And so when Paul says both Jews and Greeks, we can simplify that as simply saying everyone. Everyone. And he's saying that everyone is sinful. Everyone is full of sin. And that's bad news, that we are all full of sin. Now, some of you may think, no. I know I've messed up a little bit, but I'm not that bad. I'm not as bad as, as that movie star I see on TV. I'm not as bad as my spouse. I'm not as bad as, fill in the blank there. But Paul then is going to talk about, in the next number of verses here, why this is the case. And so I'm going to break it up into 3 categories here in the next 9 or so verses. And so here's the first category in verses 10 through 12 about why we are so sinful. And this is what the main one is, that this is a sinful core. A sinful core. It means like we're sinful down to the heart. Verse 10. As it is written, none is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. One evening I was on a mission trip in Thailand, hanging out with I was in high school. I was hanging out with some of my friends there on the patio of the complex. And one of the guides brings us some snacks. And the snacks there that he brought us was chocolate-covered crickets. Chocolate-covered crickets. Now, these crickets were covered in chocolate, hence chocolate-covered crickets. And for mostly they were covered in chocolate there. So you could occasionally see some little antenna sticking out or a little leg here and there. But for the most part, it was chocolate. And we all like chocolate, right? All of us like chocolate. And so guess how many of those I ate? Zero. Because even though I like chocolate, and I like chocolate a lot, even though I like chocolate, listen, I will not eat chocolate that has a disgusting thing inside. Just not me. Someone came to me after the first service and said, I remember when I was little, we used to catch crickets and boil them in tuna oil and eat them. And I was like, have at it. Not me. Not me. Now, in these verses, Paul's not addressing actions in verses 10 through 12 when he's talking about a sinful core. So he's not saying at this point, he will later, not saying that the actions that we're doing are sinful. He's simply saying that we are rotten, dirty, disgusting down at the beginning, sort of like those chocolate-covered crickets. And so at the core, we are rotten. Now, let's think about this. Can something that's rotten deep down inside look good on the outside? Yeah. Chocolate-covered crickets, if you put enough chocolate on it, will look okay. There's other things that can look good on the outside, but still be rotten in the middle. And so you can do good actions and still be rotten inside. You can do religious things and still be rotten inside. And that's why Paul says back in chapter 2 that good behavior or religious behavior is not what makes you saved. Is not what earns you a spot in heaven, because that is only done through Jesus. And so we are rotten at our core. And so then as he goes through these 3 verses here, 10 through 12, he quotes Ecclesiastes 7:20 in describing how rotten we are. And the first one is that we are rotten in our righteousness. He says in verse 10, none is righteous. And you think, what about Mother Teresa? She did all these amazing things and was so kind and giving. No, not even her, Paul would say, if he knew her. But second, we are rotten in our understanding. Let's go back one slide there. We are rotten in our understanding. He says in verse 11, no one understands. No one understands. And so this is not to say that rotten people can't be smart. And so if you can take a look at many of the universities that are out there and see lots of smart people, but many of those people are far, far from God. And so, in other words, you can have knowledge and not know Jesus. Now, sadly, hell is going to be a place that's full of quote-unquote smart people. And that's why Proverbs 1:7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so if you want to get smart from a biblical standpoint, you need to get into the Scripture and you need to learn about God and you need to learn to fear God. Here's the third way that we are rotten. We are rotten in our spirituality. He says in verse 11 and 12, no one seeks God, for all have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. So just look around at the world, and we can see lots of people striving for things, striving for religion, doing religious actions. But all of these eventually end up as worthless endeavors. I saw a picture. You can go ahead and put that up on the screen there. This is a picture from the 2016 Olympics out in Brazil. And if you notice there, behind the swimmer, this is a lifeguard. A lifeguard at the Olympics at a swimming competition. Let's just think about that. Now, you can just tell that she is having the time of her life. Not. She's just sitting there bored, like, what am I doing with my life here? Being a lifeguard at the Olympics, that feels like a pointless endeavor. And that's what many of us do as we seek to pursue religion on our own. We do these worthless, these things that end up feeling pointless in the end because we're striving in our own power. That's what Paul's saying. It's a rotten spirituality. And so that's why Paul concludes, based on our sinfulness, that no one does good, no, not even one. Not even one. Not even the person that you can think of in this world that was the most spiritual, kind, caring, loving person. Not even them. And so people are rotten from the core. The second thing that we see in terms of sinfulness is sinful speech. Sinful speech. And so there's a sinful core, but then there's a sinful speech in verse 13. And so Paul's going to give a very graphic picture of what we look like apart from him when we just speak on our own. Verse 13. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps, I had to practice that last night to make sure I didn't slip up. And then an asp is a viper, by the way, is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. And so every one of these lines shows us a very strong picture of what Paul is saying often comes out of our mouth. And so we are we speak sort of like an open grave. I mean, none of us wants to go walking through a cemetery. And just a couple of months ago, we were walking in through a cemetery and we saw all these tombstones with my kids. But never were we like, oh, I hope someone's left an open grave there. No, that's not something that we want to see. And so what Paul's saying is essentially that our speech is equivalent to this. It's equivalent to the walking dead. Now, just to prove this point here, I want you to think of our country and really of the world. We are going through a technological revolution where communication, among many other things, but where communication is totally different than it was 100, 150 years ago. And so things that we're doing today just couldn't even be imagined many, many years ago. So with all that communication, we as a people, we as Americans are better off, right? No, not always. No, in fact, many studies will say that with these advances in technology, it gets more difficult for us. For example, looking at social media more leads to higher rates of depression. And so a simple look at Facebook proves this point that there are people just full of open graves coming out of their mouth on social media. There's a popular community on Facebook called Bringing Dairy Together. Yeah, that sounds so inviting, doesn't it? But last year, as we were around the political season there, it got so heated on that page that the moderators had to turn on this post approval. And so now anyone that posts something has to be approved by an adult, basically, because our speech is full of emptiness, of grave-like speech here. And so a blog or a Facebook group that's on the topic of bringing people together is tearing people apart. Not by the creators of this, simply because that's who we are at our core. So that's verse 13 and 14 that Paul gives us, sinful speech. Let's go on to the next one here. Verse 15 through 18, we see sinful actions. Verse 15, their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. In the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So people default to violence. And you may think, no, I have never killed anyone. And if that's you tonight, hopefully it's all of you tonight, and I'm glad. Many of you know where I live, and so I don't want you all come to my house if you're like, oh, that pastor, I don't want that. And so I'm glad you haven't actually killed someone. Let me ask you, have you ever wanted to? When someone cuts you off on 93, do you say, God bless you, or do you say, that, And really, the only reason we haven't killed people is because we have restraint here, and sometimes it's a lot of restraint that keeps us from doing that. When I lived in Kentucky, my wife and I had, at that point, we had a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so at one point, my kids, the 5-year-old and 2-year-old, were upstairs in our house and in their room playing. And my wife and I were downstairs in the living room relaxing. And all of a sudden, we hear this scream of pain. And so we run upstairs thinking, one of the kids must have just lost a limb. Something must have just been chopped off by the other. I don't know. So we run up there, and my 5-year-old is crying and crying and crying. And eventually, we're able to get out of him that he was playing with a toy that his sister wanted to play with, and he wouldn't let her. And so she went up and bit him. Just bit him big time. Now, I can assure you that we never had to train our 2-year-old to do that. There was never a point where we were like, now, Julia, come. If you don't get what you want, use the teeth. No, because that just comes by nature. We don't have to train our kids to be violent when we don't get what we want. That just happens. In fact, we have to train them to do the opposite. That's what Paul's saying here. And then Paul concludes in verses 19 and 20. And what he's saying there, he's giving the implications that if we are full of sin, if every area of our life is full of sin, then we are in big trouble. Verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So if I would summarize those two verses into just one sentence, Paul is saying that you can't make yourself sinless enough to be accepted by God. In your own power, you cannot make yourself sinless enough to be accepted by God because you are too full of sin. You're rotten at the core. You have sinful speech. You have sinful actions. There's nothing you can do in your own power to get unsinful enough, if I may start making words here, to be right before God. Let me give you an example here. I want you to picture your life as like this pitcher of water. And this is pretty good looking water here. This is right out of the tap, so this is good Hampstead well water. Now, sin, on the other hand, I want you to picture as like this stinky fish. And so here we have a stinky fish. And by the way, I have 2 extras if anyone wants any. We have them in the freezer here. Now, when you sin, what you're doing here is you're taking your stinky fish sin and you're putting it into your life. And then it's going around there and you're sinning and sinning and sinning. And eventually you're like, all right, I need to get this out of my life here. And so you maybe fix your actions a little bit. You maybe try to clean up your speech around your pastor. You're like, oh no, I cannot say those words around him. And so eventually you're like, oh, got it. Now, with this in mind, let me ask you, is this water clean? No. Would anyone drink this water? Not me. Not me. Because even though you may take your stinky fish sin life out of it, you are still full of sin. And so even though the sin is out, your life still has that dirtiness, that rottenness at the core. I'll leave this here for anyone that wants it after the service. Now, we may pull sin out. We may start to look good. We may start to clean up ourselves, but that doesn't clean up our life. And since we are rotten at the core, Paul's saying that there is no way in our own power that we can make ourselves unrotten. Nothing we can do can fix the problem on our own. I read about a submarine in Spain that was built back in 2013, and it was one of 4 submarines that they built at that time. And apparently, when they were making the plans for it, someone made a mistake and they moved the decimal point in the wrong direction. And when that happened, they built it out. I don't know how far they got along, but they built it. They started building it. And then they eventually realized that there was a problem with it because it was 70 to 100 tons overweight. And so, if they just continued like that, they realized that that submarine was only going to go in one direction when it went out to the water, and that's down. That was a one-way trip. And so they had to spend millions of dollars to extend the hull. In fact, I read it was $9.7 million per meter of hull. I don't know how many millions they had to go out there, how many meters, but a lot of money to fix those submarines. Now, they were able to fix that big problem. We, on the other hand, we have a big problem that we cannot fix. We cannot fix it. It's not like, it's just a lot of work. I'm going to work hard, and then I'm going to spend that money, and then we get it fixed. No, we're not like this. We can't fix the problem on our own. And so, without a solution, we are destined for an eternity without God in hell. And so that's as far as we're going to get in our passage today. And let's go ahead and pray. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to give you just a little preview of what's to come. Because I don't want you to leave feeling hopeless, because our situation on our own is hopeless. But let's now look just a little bit, one verse ahead. We got through verse 20 in our passage. Preview of what's to come. In verse 21 and 22, this is what I call the hope. We saw the bad news. This is the hope. Paul starts out by saying, but now. We were in deep doo-doo, but now. And his solution is Jesus Christ. And so we'll look at this passage later on, but I want you to see what Paul's getting at here. What he's saying is that, yes, we are full of sin. Yes, even at our best, we are too sinful to fix the problem. And that's bad. It is a bad situation that we're in, but now Jesus Christ. Let me read how he puts it in Ephesians chapter 2. And as we do that, Jared, you can go ahead and come up and as we start to wrap up. He says in Ephesians 2, and you were dead in the trespasses of your sins, in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air. Skip to verse 3 there. Among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. But God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love by which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Jesus Christ. By grace you have been saved. And so, listen, in Christ, everything changes. He can take the bad situation in our life, and if you will put your faith in him, he takes the bad and he turns it into good. And so let me give you just a little summary here of what Jesus Christ can do. You see, you were dead in your trespasses, but through Jesus, you were made alive in Jesus Christ. You were a sinner, but through Jesus, you have a Savior. You were God's enemy, but through Jesus, you were brought into his family. You were under the wrath of God, but through Jesus, you are now under the grace of God. You were a child of the devil, but through Jesus, you are now a child of God. You were afraid of death, but through Jesus, you can tell death, "Oh, death, where is your victory?" You were unrighteous, but through Jesus, you were made righteous. You were headed to hell, but through Jesus, you are now headed to heaven. And lastly, you were without hope, but through Jesus, you can now have hope. So yes, things are bad. And that's the diagnosis right there. But the solution is, but now Jesus Christ. So I want to ask you, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with it? And maybe you've turned to him in the past, but you've sort of strayed away a little bit. Maybe you've defaulted into moral behavior or religious behavior, or maybe you've just gone just all chapter 1 here. You're just doing your own thing. I want to encourage you, but now, Jesus Christ. No matter where you're at, let's come back to him. Come back to him and turn and put our full faith and confidence in him. Father,